So here we are back again. It's been a hot minute. I know I should have been back sooner, but sometimes life gets in the way when you're busy making other plans. But yeah, so today we're actually in Liverpool's Georgian Quarter again, and currently we're on a street called Huskisson Street. Now Huskisson Street was famously named after the guy, William Huskisson. I think he was born in 1730, as the first casualty of a train. He was the first person to be run over by a train. Now, I've seen people tell this story before, and I've noticed sometimes there's been inaccuracies in things, and there's also been a lack of talk about who he was prior to his accident, which became notorious and, in a sense overshadowed him. So today I'm going to try and tell you a bit more about the man himself, although in short form, because this, accident story is quite long. But I'll also leave some links as well in the comment description to tell you a bit more, even more in depth about his history, because you could read hours and hours and hours about him. It's a bit windy today, so bear with me as we go on this little journey. Also, I'm not sure if I mentioned, he is buried beneath Liverpool's Anglican Cathedral here in St James Garden, which is still it's a public park now, but it was a cemetery. And interestingly, where this road ends, his mausoleum where he was buried is more or less directly opposite that. I don't know if it was strategically placed there because the street was named after him afterwards, but we will see. Now, I'll tell you a bit more about the man himself. William Huskisson, PC, born the 11th of March 1770 and died the 15th of September 1830, was a British statesman, financier, and Member of Parliament for several constituencies, including Liverpool. He is commonly known as the world's first widely reported railway passenger casualty, since he was run over and fatally injured by Robert Stephenson's pioneering locomotive rocket at the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830. However, a number of fatal railway accidents had already occurred before this, allegedly 2 on the Liverpool to Manchester Railway and also a woman in India, although Huskisson is still considered to be the first. Huskisson was born in Bitsmouth Court, Melbourne, Worcestershire, the son of William and Elizabeth Huskisson, both members of Staffordshire families. He was one of 4 brothers. After their mother Elizabeth died, their father William eventually remarried and had further children by his second wife. Huskisson was a student at Appleby Grammar School, a boarding school designed by Sir Christopher Wren in Leicestershire. In 1783, he was sent to Paris to live with his maternal great-uncle, Dr. Richard Jem, who was a physician to the British Embassy there. He remained in Paris until 1792, and his experience as an eyewitness to the prelude and the beginning of the French Revolution gave him a lifelong interest in politics. Huskisson first came to public notice while still in Paris. As a supporter of the Moderate Party, he became a member of the Club of 1789, which favoured making France into a constitutional monarchy. From 1790 to 1792, the Marquis of Stafford was the British ambassador to Paris. Huskisson became a protégé of the Marquis and returned to London with him. In 1795, he was appointed as Under-Secretary in the Colonial Department. In 1793, he entered Parliament as MP for Morpeth, Northumberland, as a supporter of Pitt the Younger. In 1804, he was elected for the constituency of Liskeard and became Secretary of the Treasury. He held the same appointments in Portland's ministry in 1804 to 1809. In 1811, he became a Commissioner of the Woods and Forests. He was prominent in the Corn Law debates about the regulation of import and export of grain of 1814 to 1815, and in 1821 was appointed to a committee to investigate distressed farming communities. Subsequently, Huskisson proposed a relaxation of the law. In 1823, he was appointed as President of the Board of Trade and Treasurer of the Navy in Liverpool's ministry. He sat as a member of the Bulling Committee, which was chaired by Peel. Under Wellington, he was Colonial Secretary but resigned in 1828. In In 1827, as Secretary of the State of Colonies, Huskisson confirmed the consolidated slave law, which had been proposed by the anti-abolitionist leaders in Barbados in 1824, and which had been enacted in 1828 by the Barbadian colonial legalization. Huskisson had threatened to resign on a number of occasions and had had a disagreement with Wellington over the sliding scale of the Corn Laws. Wellington may have been completely worried by Huskisson's constant threats to resign. He does not seem to have trusted Huskisson during Liverpool's administration because the Duke thought that Huskisson was ready to replace the Corn Laws as early as 1826. Huskisson tendered his resignation over what was to be done with the 2 parliamentary seats that were to be disfranchised for corruption in 1828, Penryn and East Retford. Not expecting his resignation to be accepted, Wellington perhaps was glad of an excuse to remove him. Huskisson also obtained the removal of the restrictions of trade of the colonies with foreign countries, the removal of reduction of many import duties, and the relaxation of navigation laws. He was also an active leader in the movement towards free trade. So quickly, this cut was originally made in the Victorian period. Oh no, prior to that actually, when it was a quarry. So it's late 1600s maybe, before it became a cemetery. And I don't really know the purpose of it, but it's probably for moving stone in and out. It's a great place. He lined a lot of the gravestones up here. And another cool thing is you'll see people have written the names in with the years like 1830 something, and it's all very old. I think it was a lot of the workers that had done it. But yeah, we're not here to talk about that today. We can come back here another day and talk about that, because today we're here to talk about William Huskisson, his life. It's absolutely a tremendous life, really. He'd done a hell of a lot of things. And we're going to talk about his tragic death and his tragic demise of being the first person on record, really, to be killed and run over by a steam train. So let's go and I'll tell you the story. At the age of 60, Huskisson was well past his prime. He was known to be clumsy and had endured a long list of problems from his regular trips and falls. He had twice broken his arm and never fully recovered the use of it. Huskisson had also been diagnosed with stangory, a tender inflammation of the kidneys. He had undergone surgery and had been advised by Royal Doctor William George Matton to cancel all forthcoming appointments, which included the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Huskisson chose to ignore this advice, believing the opening event too important to avoid. It was the 15th of September 1830, and in the early afternoon the bunting was out and the bands played. Great crowds of excited people thronged the railway tracks at Crown Street Station in the Liverpool district of Edge Hill, as a convoy of trains pulled out on their journey to our sister city of Manchester. On that fateful afternoon, he rode down the line in a special train constructed for the Duke of Wellington, and his guests and dignitaries pulled the locomotive Northumberland, which was driven by George Stephenson himself, the father of Robert Stephenson, who had designed the lines that they were on. The train was the only train on the south track. The other 7 were in procession on the northern track. On the parallel northern track was a procession of trains, each pulled by different locomotives. These were the Phoenix, the Northern Star, the Dart, the Comet, the Arrow, and the Meteor. Leading the cavalcade was the Rocket, which had been designed and built by George Stephenson and his son Robert. This had won a competition held the previous year at the Rainhill Steam Trains Trials to find the most successful design for a new form of locomotive engine. The Parkside Railway Station, about 17 miles, 27.4 kilometres out of Liverpool near the midpoint of the line, the locomotive made a scheduled stop to take on fuel and water. Although the company had implicitly warned passengers to remain on the trains while this took place, around 50 of the dignitaries on board alighted when the Duke of Wellington's special train stopped. One of those who got off the train was Huskisson, who approached the Duke to take this opportunity to repair their friendship after a great falling out which resulted in Huskisson leaving government, and shook his hand. At this time, the train being pulled by the locomotive The Rocket, designed by Stephenson's son Robert and partly by George Stephenson himself, approached on the other line. The Rocket was being driven by Joseph Locke, George Stephenson's assistant and future eminent engineer in his own right. A shout went up, "An engine is approaching, take care gentlemen." The other disembarked passengers either climbed back into their seats or stepped over the northern line and completely out the way. A third option was available, to stand with one's back to the stationary coaches, as there was a 4-foot gap between the lines. And even though the Duke's private carriage was wider than a standard carriage, it would still have been possible to stand between the stationary train and the travelling trains and remain safe. However, what unfolded was a calamitous series of events. Huskisson was known to be clumsy and had endured a long list of problems from his regular trips and falls. He had twice broken his arm and never fully recovered the use of it. Advised to this, and added to this, he was only a few weeks post-surgery and was present against his doctor's advice at the event. All the people who had been walking around quickly began to scramble back on board their carriages, leaving Huskisson as the last person standing on the ground, with his hand on the open carriage door. It was clear to observers that he was too close to the approaching locomotive, and an engineer shouted at him, "Hi sir, stand clear, stand clear." At the same time, people called to him from their carriages, "Mr. Huskisson, sir, the locomotive, it's up on you." But this only confused him. On realising his danger, he panicked and made 2 attempts to cross to the other line, but changed his mind and returned to the Duke's carriage. At this point, Joseph Locke, who was driving it, became aware and threw the Rocket into reverse, but it would take him 10 seconds to have any effect at all. Huskisson then panicked that the gap between the 2 trains was not big enough, and so tried to clamber into the Duke's carriage. As he struggled to pull himself up into the Duke's carriage, his strength failed, and already weakened by a recent illness, he lost control of the carriage door, which was not latched, and it slowly swung outwards, leaving him dangling directly in the path of the oncoming Rocket, which hit the door, throwing Huskisson onto the tracks in front of the train. The unfortunate MP was struck by the engine and he fell to the ground. As he did so, his left knee was thrown across the northern track in a bent position, and the wheels of the succeeding carriages crushed his thigh and leg, producing a loud crunching sound. Yes, so as you can see, we're at his mausoleum now. It's extremely grand, isn't it? So I think it was testament to how fondly he was remembered. One of the witnesses to the accident was a reporter from Gore's Liverpool Advisor. He takes up the story. Though we distinctly heard Mr. Huskisson's shriek as the carriage passed, we had no idea that any serious mischief had happened. Several of the directors and of the other distinguished visitors to the Duke's carriage immediately crowded around to offer the services. Mr. Huskisson said, "Where is Mrs. Huskisson? I have met my death. God forgive me." A door was ripped from a railway building and Huskisson was placed on it, as George Stephenson occupied the Northumbrian from the Duke's train and coupled it to the small carriage that was to be occupied by a band. The mortally injured MP was placed inside with a small group of friends. Mr. Stephenson, taking charge of the engine, set out towards Manchester at a most terrific rate, travelling from the place where the accident happened to Eccles Bridge at the rate of 34 miles an hour. They arrived at Eccles and walked from the station where the mortally injured man was taken to the local vicarage, while George Stephenson continued with the Northumbrian to find medical assistance at the Manchester station. By this time it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Meanwhile, Mr. Huskisson was losing a massive amount of blood and was failing fast. When the surgeons eventually arrived to the vicarage, they decided not to amputate, as it was bound to kill him, so he was given a massive dose of laudanum. This did nothing to relieve the dreadful agony he was suffering. Huskisson then took hold of an arm of one of the surgeons and Mr. Wharton and spoke to him. Here the reporter takes up the narrative once more. As far as we know, in Huskisson's words, "I wish you to tell me candidly what you think of my case." Mr. Wharton replied, "It is a very bad one, and I fear, sir, that you cannot survive." Mr. Huskisson rejoined, "No, that I have fully made up my mind to from the first. But how long do you think I live? The answer was, it's impossible to say exactly, but probably no more than 4 or 5, or at most 6 hours. Thank you, sir, Mr. Huskisson said, and terminated the conversation. William Huskisson then dedicated his last will, and with his wife, he took the sacrament, although his breathing was by now much laboured. Shortly after this, the dying man said, I hope I have lived the life of a Christian, and then thanked the Sturgeons for their kind attentions to him. Mr. Huskisson then took an affectionate leave of the sorrowing friends who surrounded his bedside, and a most tender farewell of his devoted wife, and precisely at 9 o'clock expired. William Huskisson was a much respected man in Liverpool and throughout Britain. Even though his campaigns for radical new policies such as Catholic emancipation made him a target of vitriol, hence the original conflict with the Prime Minister, Huskisson's death and the manner in which it occurred on such an otherwise illustrious day shocked the nation. The public subscription that was rapidly taken up was sufficient to erect his magnificent tomb and mausoleum. Charles Granville wrote about Huskisson soon after his death, and as follows. Huskisson was about 60 years old, tall, slouching, and ignorable looking. In society he was extremely agreeable, without much animation, generally cheerful, with a great deal of humour, information and anecdotes, gentlemanlike, unassuming, slow in speech, and with a downcast look, as if he was avoiding people's gazes. As a speaker in the House of Commons, he was luminous upon his own subject, but he had no pretensions to eloquence. His voice was feeble and his manner ungraceful. There is no man in Parliament, or perhaps out of it, so well versed in finance, commerce, trade and colonial matters, and he is therefore a very great and irreparable loss. It is nevertheless remarkable that it is only within the last 5 or 6 years that he acquired the great reputation which he latterly enjoyed. I do not think he was looked upon as more than a second-rate man till his speeches on the silk trade and the shipping interest, but when he became president of the Board of Trade, he devoted himself in the application to the maturing and the reducing practice those commercial involvements with which his name was associated, and to which he owes all his glory and most of his unpopularity. It is equally true that all ablest men in the country concede with him, and that the mass of the community are persuaded that his plans are mischievous to the last degree. George Granville Diaries, 18th of September 1830. Charles Granville. In the early 1940s, the town of Huskisson, New South Wales was named after Huskisson by the Governor of New South Wales, Sir George Gipps. And this is also a street, well, there's also a street here in Liverpool called Huskisson Street just above, named after him. So as I just mentioned about Stephenson and his steam rocket, and ended up living in a house more or less parallel to the grave site of William Huskisson. So I'll switch the camera around quickly. That white house there, next door to it is the house, and then Huskisson's monument is more or less down there, where at the end where my finger is. So it more or less is parallel to where he lived. He built the steam rocket, and his father built the Liverpool Manchester Railway line, both of which Huskisson was killed with and on. But I'll take you to the house now, then you can see the house from the outside, and I'll do you a little bit more on the history of that, or if I haven't already done it. And this is how close we're talking where he lived during that period. Or maybe his father had moved out by then. He'd moved out by then. But who knows, but this is how close we are to it. Cemetery gates. And as we come up here, see the row of houses on the left hand side? It's at the second one in, I think. So no, not the second one in. 1, 2, 3, 4. It is here. 4. 5. 6. 6,000. And that's where William who built the steam rocket lived. And then there's the cemetery on that side. And that kind of wraps it up for this episode of Famous Graves in Liverpool and Billy's Walking Through History. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one. Ta-ra.